Well, good morning, everyone. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. My name is Michelle Wulfestieg, and I'm here to talk about my experiences in hospice and also my personal experiences with coming close to death. And I want to start by sharing my personal story. Believe it or not, I am a 2-time stroke survivor. I had my first stroke when I was 11 years old due to a lesion in my brain called an arteriovenous malformation, and that's abbreviated AVM. So if you hear me speak of an AVM throughout the presentation, I'm referring to the lesion in my brain. And with this type of lesion, you're actually born with it. It's a congenital deformity, and a lot of people live their entire lives and don't know it's there. And other people have strokes from it because the tangle of blood vessels and arteries cause them to burst, which results in hemorrhagic strokes. So I was a perfectly normal, healthy child up until one night in the middle of the night. I was stretching and I was had my hands up over my head and my toes pointed downward, and it was just a really, really deep stretch when all of a sudden I felt this whooshing sensation inside of my skull. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And the deeper I stretched, the louder and more intense the whooshing became, until it became so loud it felt like a roaring ocean when you go underwater. And I felt something in my head burst, and it was the worst pain I've ever had in my entire life. It felt like sledgehammers were ruthlessly but rhythmically pounding into the sides of my temples. And I tried calling for my mom. She didn't hear me. I tried calling for my sister. She didn't hear me. And so I basically tried to get up and I couldn't move. And so I fell back in my pillow completely helpless until my mom came to wake me for school the next morning. When she did, I had horrible nausea and vomiting, and she thought I had the flu, not knowing that there was ever anything wrong with me. So for 5 days, I stayed home from school having this horrible stroke. And my mom didn't know any better. You know, who would think their child is having a stroke? And so after 5 days of not being able to hold down any fluids, severe vomiting, a horribly stiff neck, horrible headache, she finally took me to the doctors. The doctors thought I had spinal meningitis. They rushed me to the hospital, did a CT scan, and found out that I had this AVM, which was the largest ever recorded in history. Most AVMs are the size of a dime to the size of a quarter. Mine was the size of a sausage and went vertically into the brain on the left side through the parietal lobe, which controls language and speech, through the occipital lobe, which controls vision, and through the motor strip, which controls right-sided movement on the left side of the brain. So it was very, very large, and the doctors told my family that it was too large to physically operate on, and the next proper course of treatment was to go through 3 treatments of radiation, which were scheduled over the course of the next 3 years. So about a month after my diagnosis, I had my first treatment of radiation. They screwed an 8-pound helmet into both 4 points on my skull, and it was very traumatic and very disorientating for a child to go through something where I didn't feel prepared. It wasn't explained to me what would happen. And so I didn't realize that I'd have this helmet attached to me. I didn't realize I'd be confined. And the actual surgery lasted about 10 minutes. And unfortunately, when they radiated, they zapped the motor strip on the left side of my brain, and 6 months later, it caused permanent paralysis of the right side of my body. So suddenly, I was handicapped, not from the stroke, but from the actual radiation treatment. And so I had to learn how to do all of the activities of daily living all over again. I had to learn how to write with my left hand. I was formerly right-handed, so I had to learn to write with my left hand. I had to learn how to tie my shoes with one hand, how to button my pants, how to feed myself. You name it, I had to do it all because this side was completely paralyzed. It was like dead weight. And it was really tough, I'm not gonna lie, it was really, really tough. But I think children are very resilient, and so I just had that fighting spirit within me. I went through my second treatment of radiation about a year later. Luckily, there were no negative side effects. And when I was about 14 years old, it came time for the third treatment of radiation. And the doctors did another scan, and they said that the AVM was still there. It had shrunk, and it was now about the size of a quarter, but it was so deep in my brain that it was still deemed inoperable. And they told my family I wouldn't make it off the operating table if we did that surgery. And so he recommended doing that third treatment of radiation. However, where the tumor was located was right there in my central speech location. And so the doctors told me that if I went through that treatment, I would likely lose my ability to speak or understand language. Now, what is the most important thing to a 14-year-old girl? Talking on the phone, boys, hanging out with friends, that kind of thing. So my social life was really important to me because I'm a teenager. And so I told the doctor, there is no way I'm going through that treatment of radiation and risk becoming more disabled than I already am. And he paused and he looked at me and he said, okay, Michelle, you realize that if you don't go through that third treatment of radiation, you're not going to live to be 30 years old. And I said, well, 30 is a long way away. So I am just going to live every day to the fullest. And I really vowed at that moment to dedicate my life to just living. And I could have easily turned to a life of drugs and alcohol in an attempt to cope with my reality. But instead, I knew I was meant for something more. And so I actually decided that I wanted to play volleyball in high school because I was super athletic before I became disabled. And so I showed up to tryouts with a dead arm and a limp, and I told the coach I wanted to play, and they looked at me like I was crazy, but they couldn't discriminate. So I tried out for the volleyball team, and I actually learned how to skip my way around the court, and I learned to serve with one hand, and I made the team. By the time I was a senior, I was a varsity volleyball captain. I was the worst player on the team, but I was the most enthusiastic bench warmer in the whole entire league, and so it was really cool. I went on to college, and I traveled all over the world. I climbed the Great Wall of China with a disability and a bum leg. I saw the Taj Mahal. I heard Fidel Castro speak in Cuba. I went on safari in Africa and did service projects for AIDS patients and orphans, and it was really incredible. And what I really learned from these travels was that my minor disability, because I always kind of felt cheated before I went abroad, because I felt kind of like I got the short end of the stick. Why did this happen to me? And I really struggled with my faith and with God, and I never really understood what I did wrong to deserve a short life sentence. But I think, after I went abroad and I saw all of the disparities that occur in our world, people who don't have access to clean water, people who are suffering from malnutrition, whose parents are dying of AIDS, orphans. There's so many issues in the world that we're not aware of here in America because we have so much. And so I came back, and I honestly had a little bit of culture shock being back in a country where we had what seemed to be unlimited resources at our fingertips. We can go to the grocery store anytime. We have refrigerators to keep our food cold. It was just mind-blowing to me. And I knew in that moment that I had to dedicate my life to serving others. But I had no idea what that service looked like or what that would be. And so I attempted to find it, and I then took a death and dying class in college. And a part of the assignment was to volunteer with Hospice. And so I was volunteering with Hospice, and the patient that I was assigned to had also had a stroke. But unlike me, she was completely bedbound. She had severe aphasia or difficulty speaking, and she had children that all lived in the same area but couldn't care for her, so she was in a nursing facility. And because of the language discrepancy, she had 4 boys. And because of the inability for her to communicate, her sons felt uncomfortable spending a lot of time with her because she was difficult to understand. And so I was her volunteer, and For those of you who've read Tuesdays with Maury, it's one of my favorite books, she was like my Maury because I would go and visit her every Tuesday at 4 o'clock without fail. And before you know it, she got a clock in her room because she knew could count on me to be there at 4 o'clock every Thursday. And I asked her, what was the one thing you loved to do before you got sick? She said, I love to read, but I can't read anymore because the stroke affected my vision. And I said, okay, why don't we start a book club? And so I'd read to her about great women in America for about 10 minutes, a chapter or so, and then we'd talk and she'd share stories with me. And I learned so much about this woman who was phenomenal. She was 86 or so, and she got her master's degree in the 1930s at a time when women didn't go and get education. And she married the superintendent, and she traveled all over the world. And I learned that her dorm room burnt to the ground her freshman year of college. And so I visited her for about 2 months every week for an hour and until the week she died. And when she passed away, it was Thanksgiving break, and the professor called me and said that the family would like me to give the eulogy at the funeral. So there I was, 21 years old, giving a eulogy about a woman who I had only known for 2 months. But I had made such an impact in her life and our family's life that I had that honor of giving the eulogy. And so in that moment, I knew that hospice was where I was meant to be. And so we returned to class after Thanksgiving break, and the professor says we have 2 students whose patients have passed away over the break, and both have been asked to give the eulogy. And I knew that I was one of the students, and so I looked around the room, scanning the room for that other student, and my eyes met Steven's, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's the cute guy I have been eyeing all semester. And I was too embarrassed to talk to him. So he waited for me after class, and he walked me to my house, and I knew instantly that he was the man I was going to marry. I had a vision. I saw our wedding day and wedding dress, and I knew he had a sister. I knew what she looked like. I have no idea how. And sure enough, 6 months later, he proposed, and we just hit our 10-year anniversary. So really cool. But, my husband married me knowing I had a limited life expectancy, knowing that I wasn't going to live to be 30 years old, knowing that I was a risky investment and that he might very well have to be a widower. And so, we were humming along. I was working in hospice full time. He was doing his work, and we had a really good life. And it's easy when you have a life-threatening illness to kind of unless you're in pain and you're dealing with a disability and stuff. But I had the ability to kind of file it away in the back of my mind and not really pay attention or recognize that it was there. I always knew it was, but I just focused on living instead of focused on the dying part of it. And so my husband and I had been married for 2 years. I was working on my master's degree at Chapman, and I was working on a degree in organizational leadership. And I was running a hospice foundation. And I was just about to finish my thesis. I had that one class left. And you know how students are, they procrastinate until the last minute. Well, something in my heart told me I needed to finish my thesis that night. And it wasn't due for another week. So I left work on a Friday, and instead of saying goodbye to my coworkers like I normally do, like, bye, have a great weekend, see you Monday, I was very somber and very reserved, and I said goodbye very solemnly to all the people in my office. It was very strange. And I went home, and I typed up the last few pages, and I took it down to Kinko's, and as I was following the associate to the printer, the room started spinning. And I felt myself start to spin up and out of my body. And I thought, this isn't happening. This isn't happening. And so I sucked myself back in. And don't ask me how, but I sucked myself back in. And I continued to follow the associate to the checkout. Well, the girl at the checkout was crying, almost hysterically, and she had giant tears rolling down both of her cheeks. And I thought to myself in my head, what's wrong with her? I wish I could comfort her, but I don't feel good, and I feel like I'm going to pass out if I don't leave soon. And so I quickly learned why she was crying when the manager stormed in from behind closed doors and screamed at her in front of all the customers. And I thought, what kind of leader am I not to say anything to this guy who's clearly misusing his power to make his employees feel small? But I don't feel good, and I feel like I'm going to pass out. And so I left, even though I didn't want to, and it was pouring down rain that night. It was January 4th, 2008. Pouring down rain. And I was standing under the awning at Kinko's, holding my thesis to my chest, and looking down the street at Hoag Hospital, because I was right in Newport, and thinking, should I go to Hoag or should I go home? And I thought, no, I'm going to school full-time, I'm working full-time, I'm just really exhausted, I'm gonna go home. So I went home, and the rain pounding on my window reminded me of the pounding in my head when I had that first stroke when I was 11. But I didn't feel a headache. I just felt woozy and kind of like I was having trouble staying focused in my body. That's the only way I can describe it. And so I drove home. I got on the computer. I looked up the phone number to Kinko's corporate headquarters, filed a complaint against that manager, sat on my couch, and started going in and out of consciousness. And my husband said, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong?" He gave me some aspirin, and he quickly saw that I was falling over and I wasn't with it. And so he said, "You want me to take you to the hospital?" And I said, "Yes." So he put me in my car, and he got to a stoplight down the street from our house that's always red for like 10 minutes. And no one's ever coming. It's always no one. And he says, "How bad is it, Michelle?" And I said, "It's not good." And he said, "You want me to run the red light?" And I said, "Yes." So he gunned it. Don't ever do that. And he then pulled into the fire station that they had just built down the street from my house 3 months earlier, because he knew I wouldn't make it to Hoag. And ran to the front door in the pouring rain and said, "I think my wife's having a stroke. She has an AVM, and we knew this would happen. We just didn't think it would happen so soon." So at that point, I was really trying to hang on, and I remember the paramedic coming, and they put me on oxygen in my car. They put the seat back, put me on oxygen, and unfortunately that fire station did not have an ambulance, and so they had to call an ambulance from another station. So it took about 10 minutes for them to get there. And I remember the firefighter just in my face trying to keep me conscious, trying to talk to me, trying to get me to nod my head yes and no, anything to keep me awake. And I remember then the ambulance arriving, but I couldn't hear any sirens. It was really strange. And the ambulance, they put me on the stretcher, they put me in the ambulance, and that same firefighter who had been helping me was standing over my shoulders. And I remember opening my eyes and seeing the gray ceiling of the ambulance and this IV pole, and having that paramedic holding both of my shoulders, saying, "Michelle, stay with me, Michelle." And I remember thinking, I can't hang on anymore. This is it. I have to go. And so I went. And it was at first black, and then I was suddenly surrounded by this warm, beautiful light. And I did not go toward the light. I was a part of the light. Like it was something that I had always been, and I knew in my heart that this is where I had come from, and this is where I now belonged. And it was the most beautiful, warm sensation. It reminded me of like when you wash your clothes and you take them out of the dryer and you just hold them to your chest and you're so comforted. That whole feeling just all around you, just totally beautiful. And all of a sudden I started to hear prayers. And at first they were the prayers of my loved one, being my mom, my family, being lifted up to God, asking for a miracle. And then I started to hear prayers in every language, what I believe every language, being lifted up to God, asking for hope and for healing and for everything that we pray for. And I heard a voice that said, "You have to go back." And I didn't want to go back. I was so happy there. I was totally at peace. I was with God. It was beautiful. And I said, I don't want to leave. And I heard a voice say, "But I am with you always." I knew it was true. And so after that, fast forward to the hospital. By the time I arrived at the hospital, I was in the deepest level of coma before you die. There's something called the Glasgow coma scale, and it rates your overall level of brain activity. And to put it in perspective, a level 15 is normal functioning. So all of us here are operating at level 15. Level 5 is when they contact Donate Life to harvest your organ if you are an organ donor. Level 3, you're basically brain dead. By the time I arrived at the hospital, I was a level 3. And so the doctors told my husband that if we do not do this surgery that I was told all of my life would kill me, she's not going to make it through the night. And if she does, she has a 50-50 chance of survival. So my husband signed the consents, prayed over me, and off I went into surgery. 6 hours later, the doctor emerged without hope, head low, and told my family that my chances of survival were not good, that he didn't know if I'd make it through. And my mom asked, "Well, what can we expect if she does make it through?" And he said, if she does make it, she won't be able to talk, she won't be able to walk, she won't be able to see. And so obviously my family collapsed in each other's arms, and like basically they were telling my family to prepare for my funeral. And so my best friend actually wrote my eulogy, and they were making all the arrangements, but my husband would not let go. He was like, I'm not gonna let my bride go. So he refused to take me off life support. And he spent the night with me in the hospital every single night. And so while I was in my coma, I was there for 8 days. And a lot of times people wonder if your loved one can hear you while you're in a coma. I am here to say that once I knew I had to come back, I heard everything. I heard the doctors saying, "Michelle," if they were doing neuro checks, "Michelle, if you can hear me, open your eyes. If you can hear me, squeeze my hand." And I remember trying to open my eyes and trying to squeeze their hand, but the weight of my eyelids felt like they were made of thick steel, and I had no strength in my hand at all. But it wasn't frustrating. It wasn't like I was trapped in my body at all, because I was at such peace. I was like I was between these two worlds, just I could have gone the other way and been perfectly fine. And I remember my mom reading cards to me, and there was one card she read in particular about someone I cared for very deeply, and a tear rolled down my cheek. And my mom started screaming. She's like, "Oh my God, my daughter can hear me." And she went and called the nurses, and they came and they said, "Well, she's probably just in pain," and they upped the morphine. And so when I finally, I remember, another thing I heard in my coma was the doctor came in and he told my husband that we had to do a tracheotomy. So when you're on life support for the first 7 days, you're on a ventilator. And after that, they do a surgery and they insert a trach into your chest. And he told my husband, "We have to do a tracheotomy. You can't be on a ventilator for more than 7 days." And this was, I think, on day 6 or so. And he says, "Well, I really think my wife's going to wake up." And he said, "No, your wife's not going to wake up. Her brain activity has not improved. It's, she needs to be put on a trach. We need to schedule it for tomorrow." And Steve said, "Well, I wish you would just wait." And, he didn't. So it was scheduled for the next day. And I remember the doctor coming in the next day and saying, "The operating room is slammed. We're going to have to postpone it till Monday." And my husband was holding my hand, gripping my hand, saying, "Michelle, you have to wake up. You have to wake up. You don't want a trach." And I briefly opened my eyes, but I couldn't keep them open. And the next day I actually woke up. So because even though it was so hard for me to open my eyes, I knew I had to because I did not want that trach. So when I did wake up, I didn't know my name. I didn't know what year it was. I didn't know anything. And the only word I could say was yes. And I couldn't speak like I'm speaking now. I could only whisper. So my voice was a really hoarse, breathy whisper, like, yes, yes. And it turns out that was because they thought it was because of the ventilator being in for too long and doing damage, but it turned out that it was actually caused from the stroke. It paralyzed my vocal cords, and so I had to learn how to do everything all over again. And after I was discharged from Hoag, I was put on home health. And I had a hospital bed in my living room. My head was completely shaved from the craniotomy. I had a catheter. I could not talk. I could not walk. I couldn't count past 10. I mean, nothing. Couldn't feed myself. And I remember laying in my hospital bed and looking out my window in my living room onto a street filled with life and dog walkers and trees and grass, and having this realization that, oh my gosh, this is what my hospice patients must feel like. Weak, wounded, vulnerable, bedbound. But then to have somebody come and hold my hand and be with me or pray with me or just give me that gift of presence. And I thought, wow, this is so profound, and this is why I'm here. This is why God saved me. I have to return to work in hospice. And so 7 months later, I did just that. I went to rehab. I got my life back. I learned how to walk. I learned how to talk, intensive physical speech, occupational therapy, and I just became determined that I had survived this catastrophic incident, and I had this beautiful near-death experience. And I had to share this story with the world, and I had to return to serving those who were dying. And so 7 months later, I returned to work, and it's been a beautiful experience. That was 8 years ago, and I can happily say that night of the surgery, they removed the AVM, never to threaten my life again. So now I have a normal life expectancy, and I'm able to deal with those who are dying every single day. And so I actually wrote a book about my experiences called All We Have Is Today. And I know that some of you had put your name out front, and I'm actually going to choose somebody's name at random to win a copy of the book. So let's see here. Judy Holtzman. Yeah, here you go. Yay, Judy. Yeah, you're welcome. So, through my organization at Southern California Hospice Foundation, I have the privilege of serving about 2,500 patients a year who are facing end of life. And through my work, it is incredibly sacred, it is profound, it is meaningful, and it is the most beautiful work you can ever imagine. I'm just going to kind of give a brief description of hospice. Most of you probably know what it is, but for those of you who don't, hospice is a method of care designed to support terminally ill children and adults diagnosed with 6 months or less to live. So they are all at the end of life, and we care for patients with all disease types, patients who have cancer, Alzheimer's, end-stage renal failure, AIDS, you name it, anything that causes end of life, we are there for them. In hospice, it's completely paid for by the federal government if you're on private insurance, so there's never a bill that goes to the family. If you're on Medicare, it's 100% paid for. And with that team, you have a physician, a nurse, social worker, a chaplain, a home health aide, and a volunteer, all who go to your home to render that care. If you're not able to be in your actual physical home, the hospice team will also go to boarding cares, nursing facilities, assisted living facilities, so really wherever the patient calls home. We also care for the families 13 months after the patients pass away. because we understand that there's a lot of grief and bereavement that occurs with the loss. And so I just wanted to share with you, there's a handout on the back table, Hope Through the Holidays, and we're going to be having a workshop for those of you who have recently lost a loved one. It basically is a workshop that helps you to create a plan to get through the holidays without your loved one. It's free of charge. It's open to the community, so I just wanted to invite you to attend or invite you to take a flyer if you know of somebody who's recently lost somebody and they're struggling with this upcoming holiday season. So in hospice, we have the opportunity to really be with patients through their end-of-life journey. And some patients come on service with us and they're with us for a day. Some patients come on service and they're with us longer than 6 months, and they're actually on for a year or so if they meet the criteria and they qualify. But there is a process that happens at the end of life, at the very end, when people start to what we call actively die or transition from this life to the next. And so one of the handouts I have is Final Journey. And if you guys took this is something that we give to our families so that they can anticipate the signs and symptoms of approaching death. And really, it occurs like in the last final days of someone's life. And so you'll notice that there's some symptoms that we educate the family to look out for, things like a decreased need for food. The body metabolism starts to shut down and they don't need to eat as much. They might be confused as to who you are, who their loved ones are, time, place, location. They might become very restless and start kind of picking at their clothes or picking at their skin. And they also tend to see people in the room that other people do not see. And this is very common. Almost every patient we serve sees people in the room that we cannot see. Some of them, most of the time, they're not scary. Most of the time, they are people that are coming to take them to the next life. And then eventually, after they see those people, then they start to get mottled. Their skin starts changing color. Their breathing starts to change. They have periods where they don't breathe for about 30 seconds. It's called apnea. And then eventually they pass away. And so we see in hospice all the time evidence of an afterlife with our patients. So my first experience with death, I was 15 years old, and my grandmother was dying of bone cancer. And she had been a lifelong smoker, and she started out with lung cancer, and then over about 7 years, it had spread throughout her body until she was at the end of life. And when she had the bone cancer, it basically ate away her spine, and so she was completely bedbound. She was very, very skinny, and she started to see people in the room that weren't there. And we would ask her, my mom would ask her, "Are you scared of these people?" And she said, "No, I'm not scared, but they want me to go with them." My grandmother was terrified of death. She was so scared. She didn't want to leave. She was worried about her kids. She didn't know what me being ill and my mom, who was newly divorced, and what we would do without her. And so she had a lot of anxiety about leaving us. And so when the hospice nurse started to tell us kind of the symptoms and let us know that she was actively dying, the nurse encouraged us to give her permission to let her go. And so we told her we loved her, we gave her permission to go. And as she was leaving, and granted, her spine was like gone, she actually sat up in bed, put her hand out to the sky and said, "Up, up," and then fell back in the bed and died. Other stories, and that was just my first encounter. Other stories that I know of or heard of is a lot of times with the home health aide, whose job is to clean the patient and make sure they're groomed well. because it's such an intimate job, they really form a deep bond with the patients. And a lot of times when that happens, it's just kind of like almost a spiritual connection between the home health aide and the patient. And there was a home health aide that was bathing a patient, and he was transitioning. And she told me that when she was bathing him, at the moment that he died, she felt his spirit whoosh through her hands and up and out and forward. And I thought that was pretty amazing. It was like his spirit was leaving, and it went through her because she was touching his body. There was another patient we worked with that he was a 40-year-old man with AIDS, and he was agnostic in his faith. And in hospice, we serve all patients of all different faiths. So when we offer a spiritual care coordinator or a chaplain, we offer to pray with them or help them with unresolved issues, but also to connect them to any different type of clergy, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or agnostic or Christian. It doesn't matter what their religious beliefs are, but we know in hospice the end of life is very, very spiritual nonetheless for all people. And so this man in particular, he was agnostic, and he was very intelligent, and he enjoyed having lively conversation with the staff about religious and spiritual beliefs. And so in the days before his death, he was bedbound, and he was with the home health aide, and the home health aide was bathing him, and he asked, "Can you sing for me?" And she said, "Okay, what would you like me to sing?" And he said, "Jesus loves me." And so she started singing "Jesus Loves Me" to him. And while she was doing that, he said, "I have to go. The angels are here for me." And she said, No, you can't go. Your parents are on their way," because the parents were on their way from another state to come and visit. And he said, "No, tell them I can't wait. I have to go. The angels are here." And so shortly thereafter, he passed away. And that was a really cool story. We find that in hospice, patients will wait until someone arrives at their bedside before they go. Everything medically, they should not be here, but they will wait until that final moment when a loved one comes to finally let go. That happens all the time. And also what happens all the time is that loved ones, all the family will be around the bedside, and they all think that that moment is coming where that patient is going to pass away, and then they'll kind of like go to bed or for the night, or they'll leave the room, and the patient will pass by themselves because they want it to be more of a private time. And so the dying experience in that aspect is different for everyone. In hospice, we believe in sharing with the families we serve that there are 4 tasks of the dying. And the first one is to ask for forgiveness. 2 is to offer forgiveness. 3 is to say, "I love you." And 4 is to say goodbye. And so there was this patient that we worked with that I'll never forget. I went out to his home, and we were explaining to him he hadn't signed on to hospice yet because he wasn't quite sure if he wanted hospice. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He had about a month to live. And he was 90-something years old, but as smart as can be. I mean, he didn't miss a beat. And he was a very successful businessman. And he basically was interviewing hospice and asked us, he said, "I don't want to die in pain. I don't want to put my wife and my daughter through seeing me wither away. Will you kill me?" And we said, hospice does not do that here in California. And he was ready to go to Oregon to do physician-assisted suicide. And we told him what the 4 tasks of dying were. And we basically were able to show him that even in the final days and months of life, there is still so much life to live. There is so much closure that can occur, beauty that can occur with the family. And And so he was able to come onto hospice. He was able to call all the people that he knew in his life that he had wronged to ask for their forgiveness. He was able to let go of grudges against people by forgiving them. And he was able to tell his beautiful wife and his friends that he loved them. And when he was ready, 3 weeks after he was signed on service, he died. And it was such a peaceful, beautiful passing in his own home. And when the doctor went to go visit him, because we knew he was declining, he wasn't verbal at that time, but he lifted up his hands and touched the physician's and touched his hands, and it was like his way of saying thank you. And then he died about half hour later. And it was a beautiful, beautiful example as to how hospice can provide that closure needed at the end of life. And so, for all patients, though, we found that patients who don't have spiritual beliefs about life after death, whether if they think there's nothing beyond, whether it's no matter what the religious beliefs are, but they're spiritual, if they don't believe there's anything beyond what we have here, we find that they suffer more than patients who don't. And this is called what we call frightful distress. And when patients, when they see people in the room or whatever, sometimes they're scared of them and they don't feel comfortable and they have extreme anxiety and agitation, and it's not a pretty thing. And so we encourage families to recognize that the end of life process is indeed a spiritual process, and that it should be addressed. And so there are some spiritual strengths that we encourage families to look to. And I've said forgiveness. If you have a church community, we encourage you to go to that. If you have any belief in God or hope, that is important as well. But the people who have the issues and the frightful distress are really people who have issues of abandonment and anger or betrayal. And those are all usually directed at God, and of people not understanding why God would do this to them, or angry about maybe God had wronged them or didn't live up to his end of the bargain. I don't know. And so we really encourage the families just to have that spiritual counseling from our chaplains or our spiritual care coordinators. Yeah, it's really a wonderful, hospice is amazing, and it's deeply profound. And based upon my experiences with my own personal health struggles, I'm able to come to families who maybe have a loved one in a coma and encourage them to say goodbye. And we also know in hospice that the last thing to go is hearing. So a patient, even though they seem like they are out of it and there's no communication and they can't move and they're completely comatose, they can still hear. And we know this for a fact. So we always encourage families to talk to their loved ones when they're transitioning. I know when I was in my coma, I could hear, so I can attest for that to be true. And if you're ever in a situation where you're with someone who's in a coma, talk to them, tell them you love them, tell them it's okay, tell them, pray with them, whatever you can to bring them comfort. And so at this time, I think I'd like to entertain questions, if that's okay.